Blown away by the quality of these drawings by Clark and Rapano. My God, those are absolutely wonderful. And I have a couple of snippets. One is the idea of design coming from Rome to New York City, and the London planes coming from Rome, then London planes to New York City, and all of that. Villa Aldobrandini and Frascati coming to New York City, and then the City Beautiful movement going to the beach. So I think there's this kind of, that all transitions, and there's a lot of richness and a lot of creativity in this. And then I was also interested in this idea of the palimpsest, which Charles Birnbaum brought yesterday to the table. And it seems to me that it's very much alive, this notion in these landscapes, because they change over time. Alexandra said that Jones Beach came into its significance over time, which is, I think, really interesting, and reminds me of Charles Birnbaum's remark yesterday that the period of significance for Central Park is in the 19th century, when in fact the Central Park that we know is, as Ken Smith says, really defined by the buildings around it, so it's a living, breathing thing. So the question I have is what I'm getting from your presentations is that by and large, mid-century private open spaces in the city are doing pretty well, would you say? And that by and large, public open spaces are not doing so well. So am I right, am I wrong? Ken, do you think that private open spaces are doing well? I mean, I have questions about the Museum of Modern Art, which...
They're not dependent on public funding, so that's good. No, I mean,
are they doing well in terms of their preservation? Are they doing well in terms of the preservation of their design intent, in terms of their...
It's probably mixed, but I think where you have an owner who understands what they have and supports the protection of their resource, they have the money to maintain it, where state and local agencies don't. So there is the funding mechanism is different, and that's good.
Right.
But I think they're always under threat by owners who don't appreciate what they have.
Right. And public, see, these are, and public spaces are, I mean, is that truly true? Like, for example, there are some mid-century plazas or spaces that benefited from the plaza bonus, like 770 Fifth Avenue, which used to be the student glass building, which had the wonderful little corner plaza with a fountain and a little window into their display. That's now being built over, and clearly there's a sort of agreement with the City Building Commission. So some of those things are below the radar. I think when they don't have a landscape, maybe they fall below the radar. I'm just wondering if that's true.
Or they don't have a protective owner or a public champion.
Or an advocacy group that
I know that on 55 Water Street, Amanda Burden was very much involved in the project and has been a champion of it and has, I think, been instrumental in making sure that the owners do, in fact, maintain it properly.
And she became a champion because people made her be a champion, or she was interested in it?
No, she's inherently interested in public spaces and the design of public spaces and the maintenance of public spaces. That's her agenda.
So private open spaces are doing more or less pretty well, but public spaces are not doing so well, and they suffer from a sort of either forced nostalgia, like at the City Hall Park, or just neglect.
Yeah, I have to look into that whole story there, but yeah, I think as far as many of the I haven't done a systematic study of every single Moses Era playground and park in the city, but I would say that many of them are suffering the kinds of damage that you just talked about vis-a-vis Jones Beach, those horrific simplifications of detail and you know, guided by expedience and falling public budgets. I mean, that's the real. And you see it in all our public infrastructure. I mean, the public school 222 that I went to in Brooklyn. I mean, I walked by there the other day, and the magnificent Beaux-Arts lamp details that I remember from when I was a kid. I remember being very impressed by their spikes. Are now and are now to, you know, Home Depot, sodium vapor lamp standards. I don't know if they were stolen or just replaced with something more expedient, but the kind of transformation that you showed is something that I've seen in many of the New York parks.
And I think the other thing here is that a lot of the public spaces, the big parks, are really a much bigger scale than the private parks. I mean, you're talking, 6 miles of park, and then there's this huge program that's designed to serve as it's very heavily programmed. There's recreational spaces, and then that's integrated with design, and that's integrated with decorative features. So the program at the Moses Era Parks is so big. And then they're supposed to be publicly maintained. I mean, it's just, it's a recipe for disaster now.
But I mean, you would think that because they're used by so many people, and that sort of brings me to the advocacy dimension of what we're trying to do, because they're used by so many people, you would think that there would be a way to channel the users into being advocates for the preservation of those parks. So why is that not done?
I think there is a feeling among, and I've been getting this kind of feedback. I don't know if it's really true that the public feels that their taxes pay for this, that they should be entitled to the services and shouldn't have to pay extra for it. And then there's this other, and you're dealing with a bureaucracy that's all about, oh my God, we don't want more work. And so, for instance, I had suggested at some point that for Jones Beach at the at the ticket booths where you pay for the parking fee, you add an extra $1 as a preservation fund like they do for the theaters. And I mentioned this to the regional office, and they were like, you could see just like the terror that went across the guy's face. It was because it was going to be complicating this bureaucratic system. How do you funnel a little extra money to Jones Beach, which requires more money? The way that the financing is structured now is there's the collection of fee at the toll booths that goes to a general pool in Albany, and then it's distributed by proportion to the various parks statewide. So, the money that Jones Beach draws in doesn't necessarily mean that it gets to use all of that.
Well, it's the same thing for the parks in New York City, which is that the money that is collected by the vendors, the fees in the park doesn't go to the maintenance. So, everybody thinks that, another vendor is for the good of the park. It actually goes into the general fund. So I think
that's
more
the private,
there.
That's the private sort of concessionaire relationship, which is interesting. I think it could work, but I think at least on the state parks level, I can't really speak to the city. There's not enough. There's not enough guideline. There's not enough. And the Parks Department's afraid that the concessionaires are going to run away. So, they start their catering facility in an historic building, and it's a dog, and then they get to do what they want,
So maybe we should open it to questions. Do we have a question? Charles? I see Charles at the end. I can see him from here. Charles Birnbaum, our keynote speaker.
Thank you all.
He was burning with a question, I can see.
I have been. I'd like to actually bring it back to this idea of the invisible hand of the landscape architect, which, for me was something that we were putting a spotlight on last night. And I think for me, watching this morning, it became a larger elephant in the room as the morning progressed. Being bracketed by Tom and then Alexandra at the other end, it was just an observation. I thought it was interesting that during Alexandra's talk, Clark Rapalano's names never came up. In fact, Robert Moses, his role in that, again, it's this illusion that somehow he was the person that designed this landscape. And I was also intrigued with the idea of the Jones Beach rescue with the seahorse. It seems like kind of Save the Whales. And, to me what's kind of interesting is that this is probably a World Heritage Site. By your own introductory remarks, which are incredibly powerful in terms of the Clark and Rapalano legacy. And it just got me wondering, and I wanted to ask the panel, is there a benefit for us all looking at the Clark and Rapalano legacy holistically within the region? In Portland, Oregon, there is now a Halpern Landscapes Conservancy, and they're actually moving forward on a multiple property National Historic Landmark nomination. And last time we talked about 190 Olmsted landscapes designated. The question is, will the Clark and Rapalano legacy, once Tom's book comes out, begin to have the same Starkitect power, the same rallying cry around their legacy? And I'm curious what the panelists think about what can be done to raise that visibility as a tool to assist the rescue, both the public-private partnerships, and why we need to make that legacy, whether it's a palimpsest or an individual masterwork. Why is that important?
Well, I think to answer the question you started out with, I've reflected on this a lot. This mystery as to attribution, creative attribution, artistic attribution of the Moses legacy. And there's a number of factors why very few people, even in landscape architecture, have ever heard of Clark and Rappuano. And by the way, in a larger sense, as far as I know, there's only one of the so-called Moses Brain Trusts that has been treated to a full-length his scholarly book, and that's the bridge designer Othman Aman. I think maybe somebody was doing a master's thesis on Amar Embury II, who was Clark's architecture peer as consultant, as advisors to Moses in '34. I think his papers are at Syracuse University. But other than those two, none of these people have. And the legacy, it's a very large group of people that we know, men and women, that we know virtually nothing about. There's a number of reasons. I'll stay focused on Clark and Rappuano. There's a number of reasons for this. First, Moses had a colossal ego. As we all know, and he was a brilliant man, and he extended himself to the artistic footprint of his projects, and often claimed credit for the design intent of these projects. Gilmore Clark's widow told me once that it used to drive Clark crazy when they were at dinner parties. They knew each other socially as well as professionally. And Clark would, Moses would be going on and on about how he designed X, Y, or Z, and Clark would just be sitting there stewing. That's one part of it. The other part is that these were massive infrastructure projects. There were many, many people involved, and it was much easier for the press, for the media, to hone in on Moses at the top, rather than parse through a list of 25 different consultants and figure out who was really the main creator of this place. So we still, maybe Alexandra, you can enlighten us on this, but I still am not clear what Clark's role was at Jones Beach. I know he was a consultant, but it was, I think, Clarence Combs, perhaps, who was mainly responsible. And we still don't know. It's still an enormous area of scholarly work that needs to be done just to get these folks on everyone's screen. To answer part of Charles's second question there, that this is what will get us to appreciate this work is at least knowing who
what you're suggesting is a regional approach, which I think is really interesting as it brings us to advocacy, and I just wanted to hear your input on this. You're suggesting a World Heritage Site nomination that's based on a collection of things, and I think that's very interesting. It's very interesting for, the public works of the Moses era. It's also interesting for, the mid-century plazas, which are also part of the cultural production of a particular period. Alexandra, any thoughts about that? Ken?
Well, I know I took your name down when you were doing your opening plenary because I was like, oh, partnership, survey, so. Anything that gets the word out, and it's as Tom said, I just wanted to keep it as tight. I didn't want to get into all the details about who worked with Moses because I really wanted to talk about the preservation issues at Jones Beach and what's happening there now and how there's this parks department, which, I have to say they, at different levels, the administrators of the beach itself love this beach. They are dedicated to this beach. But there's this systematic, as it goes up the pike, it kind of things fall off the edges. And there's this great archive of documentation that has been processed through the Parks Department, but there's no finding aid, and it's housed in a beautiful facility now. They did a great job back when the Parks Department had a little extra money, but now there's nobody to access it for the public. So I don't know who's, what's out there in terms of primary source material other than there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of photographs, and I'm presuming that there are drawings. With the mosaics, I wanted to find out who the designer was on the mosaics. And that led to sort of a brick wall. It was like, well, we couldn't find anything for you, and that was the end of it. So maybe with a little more pressure, you could get access, which would be great.
I mean, the fact that the public employees, the people who work in the agencies are working relatively anonymously. Always have.
Yeah.
Because the agencies take the credit, and it seems like there needs to be an effort to bring credit to those people who worked in the agencies and popularize their work.
And fully research and fully connect the dots, because if they work on a number of parts, then you can start recognizing the style in your hand.
Yeah, but I think, regard what Charles was saying, it is more than just the individual designer for something to become, say, a World Heritage Site. You have to show that it's part of a larger movement. And clearly, this was a heroic era of public infrastructure work, and that's actually very significant in this country, largely not believed in anymore. But,
Yes,
but
that is why it's significant.
You need to rehabilitate the entire movement as well as the individuals.
And that chapter in American landscape architectural history itself has been very poorly documented, except for Ethan Carr's work with the National Park Service. And there was a book I think in the early 90s by Phoebe Cutler called The Public Landscape of the New Deal. Other than those, there's been very little work done on this, as you said, heroic era.
You have to go all the way back to Norman Newton.
Yeah, Norman Newton. The Newtonian.
Some more questions? Some more questions?
There was
Simeon has a microphone. We'll get to you in a second. Simeon, there's some questions here when you're done with this. Questions here?
Questions here? All right.
We love questions.
Got questions there? Who are you looking for? Okay.
My thought is in trying to raise money and trying to raise consciousness about this, that Moses's name is not completely positively received, and so
Now it's coming out.
so it might be a good thing to put the emphasis more on the designers and the architects, these people you don't know. And I mean, Clark, is it? His name?
Yeah.
What a handsome guy. And so how great to kind of use him and his story to maybe, and these are the things that he did that we did. Anyway, you can figure it out. But I just thought, well, it kind of might be interesting to change the focus and get Moses' name kind of out.
Well, I think we need
or
to
at least to the side.
Maybe we should keep it in and educate ourselves about what actually he has done in collaboration with these other people. I think that's another way of looking at it. But you're right, there is a question there. Other questions?
Quick for Ms. Wolfe. I'm wondering, on Long Island, as the counties became richer and people became personally wealthier, they had swimming pools and joint country clubs, whether the users of Jones Beach changed, and as a result of the changing nature or social group or class of the users, the public support for it, they have diminished in some way or changed.
Yes, I think that the character of the users probably evolved. Interesting about Jones Beach is that it was kind of conceived for an urban population. This was about moving city people out of the heat and swelter into the open spaces by the sea. And now Jones Beach is more of a suburban public beach. And it serves the town of Hempstead. Town of Oyster Bay has their own beach. I actually grew up in the town of Oyster Bay, so my beach was Tow Bay. Not as beautifully designed, but a little wilder. The usership is high. I mean, they get millions of people goes through there in a season. I don't see that as a reason for diminishing the funding. I just think it's a malaise about this idea that somehow, well, on Long Island there's like the whole notion of home rule that, don't tell me what to do, I'm perfectly fine on my own, and this idea that, big public works and big government are bad, I think we're living with that now,
Yeah, I agree. I think that's probably a big factor in this.
I mean, it's lobby day in Albany, by the way, and there's people out there who are saying, come on, there's a proposal to allocate eight I forget the number, $8 billion towards parks because there was so much upheaval last year when there was the threat of closing some down and closing some of the historic sites. But, you know, why does it have to get to this level of the 11th hour and everybody has to run out and, you know, start screaming? Like, shouldn't this be obvious that public parks are important?
Other questions? Two more questions.
I just wonder whether any of you or someone else in the audience has a comment about the changes planned for the Metropolitan Museum's landscape, so to speak, water fountains and so on in the front of the building. It's just happening now, and I think it's very much on topic. It's an open public space, but it hasn't come up, and I was just curious.
Any thoughts among our panelists? I don't feel I don't feel well informed enough personally to comment. Of course, we've become used to.
I'll step into dangerous water. I've only seen what's been published in the paper,
Is there a healthy sense of outrage? Or?
Well, I've heard people complaining about the design, and I was curious about why it was changing because I always liked that fountain that's there currently. But it became clear when I'm looking at it that clearly the Met is trying to open up those entrances to the ground level to bring public in, because they're taking that space and there's actually 2 bosks of trees and a fountain, and they're actually kind of reconfiguring it on that basis, and they are working with a very good landscape architect, Olin, to do it. And I think, you know, it is a change, but it does not look like a terrible design to me, from my perspective.
So there's an opinion.
I could be
Kevin?
wrong.
Other questions, Kevin?
For Tom and Ken, could you comment on, Tom started talking about the monoculture of street trees, which I think is a very interesting topic that no one I've heard of has addressed, and the Parks Department, as you stated, has a policy of interspersing everything, so now we have a hodgepodge of street trees. And I'm wondering, both Tom and Ken as a landscape architect, what you think about that and what might be done.
Monoculture.
My second book was a history of Elm Street in America, I think the lesson we learned in the loss of what was really one of the great vernacular spaces that this country has ever come up with, and a very American thing it was, this effort to sort of synthesize country and city. It was such a disaster when those trees disappeared, and it was all because we planted them so artificially. I mean, the American elm grows, it's a solo tree. It never grows in pure stands, and we planted it in very pure stands all over the country. So the lesson, I appreciate and am very well aware of the dangers of monoculture. So when it was pointed out to me by the Parks Department recently that, you know, they're not planting any more London planes, I certainly can understand that. On the other hand, I don't know, frankly, how you deal with that from an aesthetic standpoint. Maybe Ken, you can comment on that.
I mean, I think clearly in our cities we have to have a multi-species matrix. I mean, we're dealing with issues of global change, and you have to have that kind of species diversity for the health of the urban landscape. But within that larger mosaic of the city, there are places that are special and should be dealt with in special circumstances. And from my viewpoint, a place like Bryant Park clearly requires a monoculture or Cadman Plaza. And so, I mean, I think you have to make exceptions for those places within the larger matrix. If we have the larger matrix with the diverse species working citywide, we can tolerate areas of monoculture for artistic purpose.
Well, that's a nice solution. On these hopeful words, we'll close this panel. One more question.
I guess I'm sort of concerned. We have, at least in the city, a Parks Department that has less than 10% the staffing it had in the 1950s. We have in the city a Parks Department that has less than 10% the staffing it had in the 1950s, with a bigger portfolio in terms of landscape and facilities. And the maintenance and the recreation doesn't run itself, and we are not dealing with that. And likely what seems to be the case is the same is true in Nassau and Suffolk counties with the Long Island State Park Commission on that, with those kinds of cutbacks. I think we have to balance the Moses legacy. He was an extraordinary impresario, but why did this one white guy get all of the portfolios if that's who they were going to go to? Why didn't they go to somebody else? And lastly, since we're bringing it up to speed in here, Amanda Burton may have been helpful with 55 Water Street, but she also created the Trump Soho.
Any comments on that? I would prefer to end on the hopeful remarks that Ken made about the diversity of planting in the city and the fact that we actually can keep these London plane trees at Rockefeller University, which are so really beautiful. So thank you very much, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes.